Welcome. This is the lecture on Marxism, Marxian economics. We've now completed all the basic topics in the textbook, which cover mainstream macroeconomic theory. But I want to also give you just a taste of the two major economic theories that are outside the mainstream. They're called heterodox theories, as opposed to orthodox. The first is Marxian economics. And then next, and our last topic will be Austrian economics. Also, I want to make clear that I am not an expert on Marxism, far from it, but I've tried to pick up some familiarity with the core economic concepts. Karl Marx was a political philosopher and political activist, revolutionary. Born in 1818 in Germany, he studied philosophy and law at the University of Bonn and then at the University of Berlin. He met another German philosopher, Friedrich Engels, in Paris in 1844, and they worked together for most of the rest of their lives. Engels came from a more upper class family and was more well off financially, and he supported Marx financially for much of their work together. After graduation, Marx wanted to get an academic position, but due to his radical politics, he couldn't get a job. No university would hire him. So he became a journalist. My impression is being a journalist at that time in Europe was not quite the same as what we think of journalism today, just reporting the news. I think it was, my vague impression is that it was more opinion pieces, essentially, in the modern vernacular. Because of his attempts to start revolutions, his radical politics, he was expelled from Germany and went to France, and he was expelled from France and went to Belgium, and he was expelled from Belgium and went to London. That's where he stayed for the rest of his life, writing mostly in the British, what's the name of it? A large library. I'll remember the name, I'm sure, as soon as we're done here. And he wrote until he passed away in 1883. Marx is remembered for two major works: the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, and Das Kapital, published in 1867, the first volume published. The Communist Manifesto is a very short, really not much more than a pamphlet written for the Communist League. It was published at the start of the 1848 revolutions, plural, in Europe. It's a summary of their political views, their philosophy, their attempts at historical explanation for class struggle, and a basic statement of what communist parties should do. It was essentially a political action plan. Now, Das Kapital, or just capital, is very different. It is a long academic style work, trying to present a systematic account of the nature, development, and future of the capitalist system. Das Kapital is not about communism, or what we think of today as Marxism. It is about capitalism. It is a critique of capitalism. Marx was influenced by a wide variety of political philosophers, but in particular, he was influenced by Hegel. That that influence is very prominent in Das Kapital. The book lays out a theory of how capitalist societies function, both politically and economically. And using this framework, Marx tried to predict the future of capitalism. The core of his theory is that history is propelled forward by struggle between classes, this class conflict. And it would become more severe, he predicted, as the capitalist system developed, eventually leading to a crisis that would result from contradictions within the capitalist system. The idea of contradiction is at the core of Marxist theory. That comes in large part from Hegel. Marx claimed that each stage in the history of social organization was determined by a particular way that production was organized. In the Greco-Roman world, the economy was based in slavery. In medieval Europe, it was the feudal system, and eventually capitalism. Marx believed that each social and economic system contained contradictions, and those contradictions would become more apparent as the system grew and would eventually lead to the collapse of that stage of history. And then it would be replaced by the next stage, the next way of organizing economic production. It's the contradiction between what he called the relations of production, ownership, control of the means of production, et cetera, and the drive for economic growth, which would eventually force through some mechanism, it doesn't quite specify, an eventual transformation of the economic system into a new system. It's, for example, in the feudal world. In the feudal system, the aristocracy, lords, owned all the land, and they relied on force to compel serfs to engage in production. Marx argued that at a certain stage of economic development, the rigidities in the feudal system prevented further economic growth. To increase production further, it was necessary to transition to a new method of production, a market-based system, capitalism. And the contradictions inherent in capitalism would in turn limit growth such that to grow further, another transformation would be required to reorganize society along socialist lines. So calling Marxism an economic theory, it's not exactly correct. Marx didn't separate economics and politics. So his theories discuss how economic and political systems evolved together over time. There are 5 core elements of Marxist theory: the labor theory of value, expropriation of surplus value, alienation of the proletariat, and contradiction leading to eventual crisis. Let's go through them one at a time. The labor theory of value. From the beginning of time, or at least as far back as we have records, philosophers, they weren't called economists yet, have been asking why things have the value they do. It was a very difficult question, and it wasn't really answered until the end of the 19th century, when the Austrian School of Economics developed the marginal theory of value. That was called the marginal revolution in econ. Marx was writing several decades before the marginal revolution, so he adopted a theory that many others before him had suggested, including Adam Smith, the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is essentially that the true value of anything is determined by the labor required to create it. And critically for Marx, this works in the other direction as well. The price of labor, meaning the wage, the correct wage, the true wage, the just wage, is the value of the amount of output necessary to create one additional unit of labor. As an example, suppose 5 hours of labor are needed to produce the resources necessary to feed, clothe, shelter a worker each day so that the worker is able to work the next day. If one labor hour equals $1, then the correct wage would be $5 per day. Marx then asked a question. If all goods and services in a capitalist society tend to be sold at prices equal to the labor required to produce them, and workers are paid the value of their labor, then total revenue for business must be exactly the same as total cost. So how do capitalists earn any profit? Where does profit come from? Marx's basic answer was that capitalists get their profits by cheating their workers, exploiting them, and that all profit, without exception, came from exploitation of labor. Marx argued that capitalists enjoy a privileged and powerful position in society as owners of the means of production, and that gives them the power to exploit workers. Although the capitalist pays workers the correct wage, somehow, and Marx was terribly vague here, the capitalist forces workers to work more hours than are needed to create the workers' labor power. There's a certain amount of economic output that a worker needs to consume, to survive, to be able to work one more day. Let's say that an average worker can generate that much output in 7 hours of work and receives that output as their daily wage. But the capitalist somehow forces the worker to work not 7 hours, but say 12 hours a day, which was pretty common as a workday in Marx's time. So if one labor hour equals $1, workers produce $12 worth of products for the capitalists, but they're only paid for 7. Capitalists extract this surplus value, it was called, from the workers and take it as profit. Essentially, Marx was saying that all profits in a capitalist system come from the owners of capital stealing part of the value of their workers' labor. Next is alienation. Marx claimed that before capitalism, people were very closely connected to their work on an emotional basis. They were connected to the product of their labor. People could see how their labor resulted in production. But in the capitalist system, workers become like little mindless cogs in a great machine, where they'll perform very repetitive, frequently dangerous tasks without any clear understanding or feeling of what they were making or why they were doing it. Thus, workers became alienated from their labor. Marx's notion of alienation rests on a crucial but very shaky assumption. It assumes that people can successfully abolish an advanced market-based society and replace it with a centrally planned society. Marx claimed that we're alienated not only because many of us toil in tedious, apparently meaningless jobs, or because by competing in the marketplace we tend to place profit above human need somehow. The issue is not about toil versus happiness. We're alienated, he maintained, because we have not yet designed a society that is fully planned and controlled, a society without competition, without profit and loss, without money, without private property, and so on. A society that Marx predicted must inevitably appear as the world proceeds through history. Next, the superstructure. This is what Marx called all of the institutions in a society that prop up the capitalist system: politics, religion, laws. Marx claimed that all of these institutions exist only to enable capitalists to profit. And one of the ways they do this is by convincing workers that this method of organizing society is right. It's the way things should be. It's just. By persuading the proletariat, the working classes accept this false ideology. Marx wrote that they developed a false consciousness. And therefore, capitalists were able to keep workers complacent and to persuade them to cooperate in their own exploitation. Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci extended Marx's work on the relationship between superstructure and false consciousness of the proletariat with what he termed cultural hegemony. This is where the ruling classes create not just the formal institutions that help them to exploit the workers, but also the informal institutions. They shape social norms and culture, conceptions of justice to support their continued exploitation of labor. Gramsci's work on cultural hegemony was revived and somewhat reinterpreted in the 1960s as structuralist philosophy. So when you hear someone describe something as structural in reference to a social thing, this is, in loose terms, what they're referring to. Contradictions. Marx claimed that capitalism, like feudalism before it, contained the seeds of its own destruction in the form of internal contradictions that would inevitably lead to a crisis of production. Because capitalists are in competition with each other, they have to cut costs to survive. They do this by employing more capital. You replace people with machines. And since labor is the only true source of value in Marx's world, reducing labor input reduces the value of the output. And so the drive to reduce costs ends up reducing profits. You can't steal from workers that you do not employ. And workers who are also consumers can only buy products with their wages. So as total wages paid to workers goes down through cost cutting, total spending also goes down. This is in some ways similar to the Keynesian argument. In an environment of falling profit, each capitalist responds by laying off workers, thus reducing labor cost. But this also reduces aggregate demand and pushes profits even lower. Marx claimed this would inevitably lead to a crisis where workers' wages are insufficient to purchase the output that they are creating. To keep profits from falling, businesses will take advantage of economies of scale. They will get larger. They will merge. And business owners will try to intensify their exploitation of their workers, drive wages down even further. So over time, the poor will become even poorer, which he called the law of increasing immiseration of the proletariat. The proletariat, roughly meaning the exploited working class, as opposed to the bourgeoisie, the exploiting capitalists. Marx predicted that competition among capitalists would grow so fierce that eventually most capitalists would go bankrupt and become members of the exploited working class, the proletariat, leaving only a very small handful of capitalists who would become essentially monopolists, and they would control essentially all production. This, to Marx, was one of the contradictions of capitalism. Competition, to him, instead of creating better products at lower prices for consumers, in the long run only creates monopolies and more extreme exploitation of labor. The more advanced a capitalist economy becomes, Marx argued, the greater these contradictions and conflicts. The more capitalism creates wealth, the more it sows the seeds of its own destruction. Also, Marx thought that the anarchy of an unplanned, complex market economy would create repeated economic crises where supply and demand were not in equilibrium. And that these crises would cause huge swings in business activity and ultimately severe economic depressions. He was talking essentially about the business cycle, although it wasn't termed that at the time. And crisis. Over the course of its evolution, capitalism brings into being a working class, the proletariat, consisting of people who have a fundamental antagonism to the owners of capital. The control of the state by the wealthy makes it ineffective in fundamental reform of the system and only leads to passage of laws favoring the capitalists' interests. A quote from the Communist Manifesto, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." So now, highly urbanized and thrown together in factories where they can communicate with each other, workers begin to recognize that they're being exploited, that their needs are not being met by the capitalist system. Needed social goods and services are not being produced because there's no profit in it for capitalists who control the means of production. And you would see develop extreme wealth for an extremely small number of people and extreme poverty for the many. That would become the norm. As this crisis mounts, Marx argued that the proletariat will become more politically leftist, although governments will be blocked from providing real structural change because of the power and dominance of the capitalists in the system. Eventually, more economic growth becomes impossible within a capitalist framework. So Marx says that these contradictions of capitalism will produce a revolutionary crisis where the entire capitalist system, private property, money, market exchange, profit and loss, labor markets, will all be swept away and replaced with an entirely centrally planned economy that will finally end all exploitation and alienation. That is his vision of the socialist revolution. Now, what will this next stage paradise, this utopia, look like? All political and economic power would be given to the new government, which would be controlled by the Communist Party, because the Communist Party would be the representative of the proletariat. It would be the proletariat acting collectively. All economic production and all economic decisions would be planned and dictated by a central authority, all for the benefit of the working class. Marx predicted that the contradictions inherent in capitalism would become more severe over time as capitalist economies developed. Therefore, the inevitable crisis, the revolution, must first happen in one of the most advanced capitalist countries. But that's not what happened. The first Marxist revolution happened in Russia, which was, at the time, the very early 20th century. In some ways, Russia was still a feudal society. It hadn't even fully transitioned to capitalism yet. Also, Marx claimed that once the first, essentially, domino fell, the first capitalist society was overthrown, that all of the others would fall shortly thereafter as the socialist revolution swept across the world. Communism has not spread across the world. It spread a bit in the 20th century, but as of I'm recording this, the year 2020, there are only 4 allegedly Marxist countries left in the world: China, Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. And China really started abandoning Marxism as an economic system more than 30 years ago, although they still embrace some elements of Marxism in political terms. But in practice, China really isn't Marxist anymore, despite the symbols. Also, the foundation of Marxist economic theory, the foundation upon which everything else rests, is that capitalists can only make profit by extracting surplus labor from workers, exploiting them. But we've known that the labor theory of value is just simply wrong for more than 100 years. My impression is that more modern Marxian, they call themselves now, theorists have taken a variety of approaches to try to get around this inconvenient fact that everybody knows the labor theory of value is wrong. I'll leave it at that. But without great success. Another core principle underlying Marxist theory is that over time, the exploitation of workers, of the proletariat, must become more severe. Capitalism must drive the masses further and further down into grinding poverty, so that eventually, when they can't take it anymore, they rise up in revolution and throw off their chains. The 20th century was a huge natural economic experiment. Marxist economics has been tried And as far as I'm aware, it has failed every place it's been tried. But it is the working classes in the advanced capitalist countries where Marx predicted intensifying exploitation of labor, that is a continuing driving down of wages to augment surplus value and thus the law of increasing immiseration of the proletariat. It is these workers in the advanced capitalist countries who have actually seen the largest increase, the largest improvement in standard of living over the 20th century. Real wages have gone up by orders of magnitude over that time. So that is pretty much what I know about Marxian economics. Next, Austrian econ. I'll see you then.